Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources and your host for the show. We're coming to you from San Francisco today from the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center, which is a great facility that helps educate and mentor entrepreneurs. And if you're one of those that fits into that, this is something that you really need to look into. It's a great facility and organization. So today's show, we're going to be talking about the unwritten role of the chairman of the board. And it's very appropriate because we're here today at the Equilar's Board Leadership Forum. And who better to talk about that than somebody who's a board leader themselves? Welcome my guest, Mike Smith, who's the chairman of Zebra Technologies. Mike, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you, TK.
So you are the chairman and the governance chair of Zebra. And when I looked at your information, you have served on every possible committee that a board could have, search committees, strategy committees, whatever. So obviously you got the chairman's title because you certainly build up quite a resume of serving as chair or member of all these committees. So you're a perfect person to ask this question. The job of the chairman, and we're talking outside chairman now, the job of the chairman has certainly changed, okay? There was a day when it was almost like who had time to do it or who was the senior person. Today it's got a much bigger responsibility. Talk a little bit about how the chairman's job has evolved over the last 5 or 10 years.
Well, TK, I completely agree. The chair role is certainly no longer the somewhat empty ceremonial puppet head role that it may have been in decades past. It's a role with real governance substance, and it requires active leadership. You know, I think of the fact that the CEO as head of the management team really reports to the board, which has the solemn responsibility to hire and fire the CEO and his team, to compensate the team. But you know, the board of directors also has a boss. They're not the top of the food chain. And that boss is the shareholder. And the chair has a particular role as sort of an elected peer representing the board of directors to really be the face of that board to shareholders. I think that given that perspective, which is a shareholder-oriented perspective, it's fair to say that I think there are 3 particular areas of accountability that the chair role kind of has. The first is board composition. The second is what I would call board hygiene. Does the board function well and does it function smoothly? And lastly, there's the issue of sort of board interaction with management. Is it healthy? Is it effective? Maybe I could take a moment and talk a little bit about the first one, which is board composition. I think the chair has a special obligation there to make sure that the composition of the board really fits the business that it's overseeing and has a membership that not only fits what the company's doing today, but fits where that company is going and what its strategy is for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 7 or 8 years. That requires a level of depth and sort of virtuosity and flexibility on the board that isn't easy necessarily to achieve. It's one thing to have a board that fits the business today. It's another thing to have that same board be in a position to fit that business, especially after a transformational strategy for what it's going to be 5, 7, 8 years out. I'd also add there's really a second area of board composition that I think is very important. The chair has to show real leadership in having the board have some ownership DNA, which is thinking like owners. I think that's very important. My own personal view is that having shareholders entrust their capital to us as a board really creates an almost sacred responsibility for us. I mean, to exaggerate the point, it's sort of like becoming responsible for someone else's children for a weekend or a vacation. It's a super important thing you don't want to make a mistake on. And you know, on this overall point of being a shareholder, let's look kind of at the private model. If you have a family-owned or owner-founder, entrepreneur-controlled business, in that circumstance, ownership and management are the same. They're either the same individual or the same group of people. If you move to private equity, it's a little different, but the board of directors is the ownership. And the board of directors, as the ownership, has direct, intense engagement with management. It's very same in the venture capital world. There also, the board of directors is ownership, and it's very close to management, meets with management during the meetings, meets as frequently as necessary between meetings to make sure that company has a real chance of success. But now consider with me how different the public ownership model is. It's very peculiar how enormous the distance is between ownership in the public model is from management and from actual operation of the business. I think that comes about because of our complex securities laws. It comes about because of our deep American capital markets, where you get an enormous diffusion of ownership among institutional shareholders and retail shareholders. And I'd have to say, look, the American capital markets model has been unbelievably successful. It's been great for America, it's been great for the world, but there is this flaw that there is so much distance between ownership and management of the business. So it's no wonder that shareholders really want to close that gap. They want to get closer to the companies, they want more accountability, and I think directors should not view that as anything other than normal. It's a normal thing, it's not alien, it doesn't have to be adversarial. Sometimes the tone of engagement feels adversarial, but the fact that shareholders want to be closer is itself quite normal. So I think the chair has a particular role in that context to make sure that the board has that ownership DNA in its mentality. It doesn't have to be in every single member of the board, but it has to be on the board. And that the board is oriented to showing continuous respect towards the needs of outside capital. So what does it actually mean, if we can talk for just a second, to think like an owner? What does that actually mean? So in a board of directors of a public company, what I think it means is we're all sitting around a big table in a meeting, and we're thinking that we own this business. This is our family business. It belongs to us as individuals. Would we make the same decisions in that scenario? Would we hire the same CEO? Would we hire the same management team? Would we have the same compensation structure? Would we allow the same payouts of actual cash and stock to management under that compensation strategy? Would we embrace the same overall strategy for the company? And lastly, would the enterprise risk profile for that business, in all its many components, would we pick that same profile if we own the business? And I think if you've got a good board, a seasoned board, a board with conscientious directors, the answer should be yes, we'd have made the same decisions because we're thinking like shareholders. So there, I really think, is a good example of how much the role of chair has evolved over the past couple decades.
Well, that's fascinating. We've talked on the show, particularly when we did our investor board performance review, how the influence of activists are pushing to have management think more like private equity, be more involved in operations. I'm not sure that CEOs are necessarily excited about, that push, but I think you're right that I think we're going to feel more pressure and we're going to see that. Now, we only have a couple minutes left, Mike, but I really have a key question for you. When you're responsible for board leadership as the chairman, there's a lot of rhetoric out there that collegiality is important. At the same time, in today's world, when you're a leader, sometimes you have to do things that aren't popular, okay? And that goes for the board too. The board just can't flounder. It needs leadership. How do you balance the collegiality and the responsibility that you have to get things done right?
Well, this is a polite way of asking, I think, an even more blunt question, TK. Is there a point where collegiality and maybe even civility come to a stop? In a situation where, for example, a company is grossly underperforming, or where a board has such intense disagreement over given issues that it no longer is able to function effectively. But here's my answer. If you have a good board with very seasoned directors who understand their roles and who have a conscientious concern for the future of the company, I think it's possible that collegiality can coexist with profound disagreement and very vigorous debate. But the chairman has a very important role. The chairman has to create the atmosphere where all the viewpoints can get aired and fairly aired and openly aired, and create an atmosphere where the dialogue doesn't turn toxic, it doesn't get personal in such a way that relationships get broken and the functionality of the board collapses. I think that's a delicate skill, it's a tricky skill, but it's a critical skill for the chair. And I think it is possible, with you have the right people, to keep collegiality in place and still have a functioning board. Now, I'll point to the US Congress. I don't think you can go on TV and call your colleagues names and then go back in a room and say, we're going to have a great working relationship and constructively solve our problems today.
I wouldn't disagree with you, but it looks like that's what we've got ahead of us, which is disappointing. I think everybody certainly was looking forward to change. Well, Mike, we're about to get to hear from other people and what their views are on board leadership, but I think you hit the nail right on the head. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today on the show. We appreciate that. So that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.